I'm Alice Loy, and for those of you who haven't seen me this week yet on a screen, here I am again. And I'm delighted to be here. Happy Friday. It's almost a weekend. I run creative startups, and we have been working with the New Mexico Department of Economic Development for about 7 or 8 months now, putting together a plan for the new division that was formed by House Bill 8 in the 2023 legislative session, which established for the first time the Division of Creative Industries, which we call CID. So if I say CID, think, oh yeah, that new division at Economic Development. And we've been working on a plan for how that division can most effectively both grow its own resource base so that it is a sustainable division, but also engage very meaningfully and deeply in communities across New Mexico to lift up people building creative businesses, arts and culture nonprofits, and everything in between. So as part of that, we are hosting Creative Industries Week. For the first time, we're hosting a whole week for the state of New Mexico. And one of the things that we realized early on is sometimes in New Mexico, we can feel a little isolated. We're kind of far away from everyone, it feels like. And there are amazing people doing amazing things all across the country. And so we said, why don't we reach out to people who are doing amazing things and learn from them? How are they building their creative economies? How are they planning for success? What has surprised them? What's been challenging? How did you overcome that? And in the process of finding really interesting projects and people, we met with the ladies here, Annette Roth, who is the Community Development Manager for the state of Washington's Arts Commission. She wears a lot of hats, and she'll share those today, and maybe also share how wearing all those hats is both exhausting but rewarding because she gets to sort of like layer outcomes. And Claire Rice, who is joining us from Illinois, where she serves as the Executive Director of the Arts Alliance of Illinois. Thank you both so much for being here. And maybe we'll
Thanks,
start with,
Alice. Glad to be here.
I sort of awkward, when we were doing this at the beginning of the week, I was reading bios and I got awkward. So instead, I think it's maybe a little more fun to hear. We'll go alphabetically from Annette first. What got you into the work that you do? And what keeps you sustained? What are the projects that really have you on fire? And then we'll move to Claire with the same questions.
That's a great question. So let's see. I have a background in graphic design. I started my career as a graphic designer way back in the day, and doing web development. And so I have a marketing and communications background as well. And unfortunately, the company that I owned was a victim of the Great Recession. So it went out of business, and I took a job at our local economic development agency, doing marketing. I was their marketing manager essentially. And when I got to that organization, I really got to know a lot about economic development. It was something that interested me a lot. And so I worked there for many years, working at the county level economic development agency in Thurston County, Washington, which is where Olympia, our state capital, is. And then the Creative District program here in Washington State was passed, legislation was passed in 2017. And so I was brought on board to develop and launch the program for the state of Washington. And so, my background as a small business owner and as a creative myself, and then working in economic development was, sort of the thing that I could synthesize to bring all of those things together. So I'm actually not in Olympia right now. I'm in a town called Chewelah, Washington, which is, for those of you out there in the Zoom universe are familiar with Washington State. It's about an hour north of Spokane. We're having our annual Creative District Conference right now. So they're all in session somewhere else in a different location, and I'm here at our event. So it's pretty exciting. We have about 60 folks from our creative districts around the state at the convening, learning and networking and all that kind of stuff. So it's been really fun. That's one of the cool projects that I get to work on. What sustains me, it's for me, it's really seeing the work that the people are doing within their communities, taking the notion of what does the creative economy and the creative sector mean to their individual communities? How can they use that to develop their communities, to create a sense of place, to help foster more activities, both arts and culture activities, but then other kinds of activities as well, and bringing people together to share that, to me is very gratifying to be able to see. Like, I don't, I always like to say, like, they're the ones who are doing the great work. I'm not, I'm just the facilitator of that. And so for me, that's the thing that I love the most about my job.
Awesome. Thanks. Claire?
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me, Alice, and great to be in New Mexico, not in New Mexico. Coming to you from Chicago, the land of the Council of Three Fires, but we do statewide work at the Arts Alliance. So the Arts Alliance is a creative sector advocacy organization, that really started out as, I would say, a nonprofit arts advocacy organization and has expanded its mandate. That expansion is one of the things that keeps me pretty excited about this work 8 years in. My background, I'm a recovering singer, still do weddings and funerals, if anyone needs me. But other than that, really keeping the creativity on the administrative side most of the time these days. But yeah, kind of wended my way through policy, education, management consulting in the government space, and then performing arts presenting into more back into the policy space, combining my policy education with my arts and culture background. So it's been a joy to kind of bring all of myself together into this work. I think, we'll talk about some of the projects that I'm most excited about, really in the context of creative economy strategy. I mean, we did just pass a creative economy strategy bill here that's going to create a task force similar to what they've done out in Washington. Little copycat legislation here, which California has done as well. So we're working on those kind of meta and planning pieces, which I know we'll talk about today. And then a bunch of really interesting creative workforce development, really trying to tap our sector into, you look at the National Endowment for the Arts, and which is, incredible, super important. Part of our work is to advocate for that cultural agency, along with the state arts agency here in Illinois and our city local arts agencies as well. But you think about the zeros on the budget there, and then you think about the zeros on the Department of Labor and workforce opportunities, like the rest of government. And there's just a whole lot of opportunity that we as the sector have not tapped into.
That's right. Yep.
Enough yet.
Yeah,
exactly. We'll say yet, but the workforce stuff is really getting me excited. We're thinking about what does it mean to create, we're calling them thrival jobs, not survival jobs, right? What does it mean to take your 9 to 5 if your creative practice doesn't sustain you entirely financially? How do we get the rest of your income to connect with your creative income more meaningfully through a workforce development context? So really excited about some of that work. And yeah, I mean, I'd say in terms of my own sustainability, personally, and how we keep going in the work, rest is really important. Trying not to overwork is really important. And then I honestly think, the advocacy space has been, as hard as it's been in the last 4 years, so rewarding. It's been the first time, I think, that this country has acknowledged the importance
Claire,
of
let's jump off on that, because things have changed. Am I right? I mean, wow, for creatives, I'll 10 years ago, in a state here in New Mexico where 1 in 10 people works in the creative economy, I had the Secretary of Economic Development look at me quizzically when I introduced myself at a meeting and say, the what? The creative? I'm sorry, what are you talking about? And I thought, okay, right? And I mean, here we are. So talk a little bit about what you are seeing in Illinois, and maybe more broadly, about what are the changes and what works with that, and what do we have to be kind of thoughtful about?
Yeah, I mean, we have to acknowledge that the largest piece of U.S. cultural policy to ever, exist, right, was the Save Our Stages Shutter Venue Operating Grants program, which invested $15 billion in the creative economy through the American, like the Rescue Plan,
The
and that
ARPA, yes,
ARPA
the
dollars,
recovery
and so
dollars,
recovery
yes.
dollars. So that piece of that statement around the value of this. I mean, the government could have let it fail, right? And so I do think that that and we've seen huge investments across ARPA and CARES and unprecedented levels of investment from our government in the work of our sector across the board. So I do think that this is a moment where we can use that as a springboard. It's not enough, and it was definitely in a survival/relief context, and we need to shift that into a investment and development context. Which is, I think, our challenge as advocates and as folks who are in government as inside advocates, external and internal. But I think the understanding of the value of the work is at least sort of a baseline for this entirely new way now than it's been in certainly in my career, and I think probably maybe since CETA and WPA and those sort of like significant investment programs on the part of the federal government.
Annette, and are you seeing similar?
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, we are. I think, for us in Washington, our creative sector is actually, there's a lot of creative tech here. So our creative sector is broader than just the arts and culture field.
Creative tech? Just curious.
So creative tech would be like software development, game development, video gaming, all of those kinds of more technical, sort of, with your computer kind of things. Probably all of those kinds of jobs that would be within that. And that's actually a humongous part of our overall economy in Washington state. And there's so many through lines between the creative tech sector and other parts of the creative sector, with arts and culture and music. I mean, you have to have musicians and people, composers to make music for video games and, all of those other kinds of things that are connected to each other. That said, that does make up a lot of the sector, and most of the extremely high paying jobs are in that part of the sector. And so our role at the Arts Commission is, we obviously want to support that, but our role is really to help support more of the traditional arts and culture kind of stuff in addition to that as well. So ensuring that those arts and culture organizations that do that work, that do programming and are those cultural kinds of institutions have a space as well and can grow along with that other part of the economy. We are seeing there's that long tail of COVID that still, I think, exists for a lot of organizations, which has been interesting to see. But, I'm at this convening right now with all of our creative districts and folks are having really great conversations about, okay, we went through COVID. We know it was a challenge. Let's move forward and come up with ways that we can work together. And so for us, I think in Washington, the one of the good things that's come out of it is this real sense of collaboration. And we all have to stick together and we all have to work together to make sure that we can all, all of our boats can sort of rise, as it were. And that's been really excellent for me to see that, coming from economic development. For us, that's how, I was sort of raised up in economic development. It's about, there's some competition, but it is about collaboration and being able to see arts and culture organizations doing that better than they kind of did before. There used to be a lot of scarcity mindset around, well, if these folks get this money, then I can't do that or whatever. And so now we're seeing these approaches where people are being more collaborative within that space.
Can you maybe speak to, Annette, because you guys in Washington have some really interesting programs or projects, initiatives where the more traditional kind of arts and culture has worked at the intersection with technology and how that has benefited both, so in my head, I'm like, okay, biotech plus ceramics. To me, I don't know if I can find but I bet if we put those two people in a room, they would totally find a way to work together. And the value that would come out would be multiplied from what they were individually. Do you have any thoughts around or stories around things like that?
I mean, I have one. I mean, it's not biotech. It's actually, with our state Department of Transportation, had an artist in residence program that was like the first of its kind in the country. This was a few years ago, kind of right before COVID is when it started. And they got a grant from Transportation for America, I believe, one of the large sort of national grants to do this. So they essentially hired these two artists and cited them at that Walcott. So their offices are down the street from ours in Olympia, to kind of help them like solve problems and look at things in a slightly different way, you know. And we as an agency have a good partnership with them with our public art program. The transportation, you know, WashDOT does a lot of that kind of public artwork when it's developing projects. You know, with our creative districts program, we have a connection with them. And, you know, for us, it's more about how do we connect with each other in these government to government agencies. So like we have a partnership with the Veterans Affairs, with the DVA, Washington DVA. We have what's called a Wellness Arts in the Military program. It's kind of like creative forces, but next level. So it's specific to, you know, Washington, and we have that. We have a tribal affairs program at our agency, which is the first of its kind. We have a tribal affairs person cited at an arts commission, and I don't believe that there are any other state arts agencies in the country that have that. It's a practice across many other agencies in Washington, and so for us, it's kind of like, how do you take all those threads and put those things together? How do you bring folks who are artists into the transportation space? How do you bring, you know, veterans who are suffering from PTSD or whatever the case might be, and their families into a healing space where they can do that kind of stuff? You know, we have partnerships with the Department of Corrections as well, which I'm sure many other you know, state agencies do, to make sure that we can do that kind of thing. And what's been really cool about that collaborative approach again is being able to see how it helps other government agencies think about their work a little bit differently, right? Which is really interesting to me.
Claire, are you guys seeing similar opportunities or activities happen as awareness and valuation of the creative economy that, you know, the Department of Transportation, we're now seeing here in New Mexico, JTIP, which is our job training incentive program, state dollars that pay for new workers in a business as long as they demonstrate that they're upskilling. They cover wages and you know, I mean, there's some really interesting things like that happening.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you know, a couple of things to build off and maybe counterpoint to some of the things Annette said. I still think our sector has a problem considering itself as a creative sector, right? Like I think
unpack that.
Well, just from the creative tech example, you know, I would, if you ask those developers and game developers, like, are you a part of the creative sector or creative economy? I'm not sure what they would say. You know, like, would they say yes? Would they say, well, no, I'm a developer, I'm part of the tech sector? You know, I mean, I think that there's sort of like and I don't think we are particularly well aligned, even within, I would say, the more traditional parts of the arts and culture sector around like the for-profit and nonprofit pieces still feel unnecessarily divided. You know, it still feels like even, you know, the individual artists and creatives have lots of distrust, rightfully so, with institutions and with, you know, so I think we're not particularly, I think,
it's not a monolith. It's more like a pile of stones.
Yes, right, exactly. And a really powerful pile of stones, right? So, I mean, I think from an organizing and policy context, it's super interesting to think about, like, what does it take to actually unify that group that's beyond just a huge pile of federal relief funds, right? Like, I think that's the question, is how do we create some of the unified messaging around investment in this sector, that and partnership. And I think some of the projects that Annette just pointed to help to do that, right? Because they start to bridge gaps between the work we do and the you know, needs or focus areas of legislators, civic leaders, business leaders, etc. I mean, I think on the kind of intersectional piece we're seeing here in Illinois, you know, I was talking about the workforce stuff we're doing at the intersection of right now the tech sector and arts and culture, which we're building. So more to come on what those kind of pathways and upskilling and reskilling opportunities will be. I think people are working across those dimensions already, but there are not traditional pathways to employment for like a graduate or a vocational, calling for anyone who is either inside or outside traditional educational systems. Like we have to make those pathways clear into whatever these thrival jobs may be that blend tech and their creative practice. And I'll say one of the spaces I'm most excited about are here in Chicago. Our Department of Cultural Affairs has partnered with the public health folks, and they're doing a workforce program, actually with the support of the One Nation, One Project, big grant, national grant, that you guys can check out, with lots of interesting kind of, cross-sector grant opportunities, particularly around health and wellness and healing type themes. But here, they're training artists to insert and certifying them to become community health workers, where they integrate their practice in the community health work. And they're working in community health centers around the city. So it's really like, but it's amplifying their own practice. It's integrating their own practice into that work. It's not compromising that practice. So I think, transportation, health, like there's an endless list of opportunities. But in order for us to reframe who creatives are, what creativity does, we have to get more sticky in those spaces.
So that brings up something very interesting that I spent a lot of time thinking about and can't figure out, but just kind of keep heading back into the dark space and thrashing around, which is, I think we're in a transition, even away from the knowledge economy. Right, we had the agricultural economy in the 1800s. Then we had the industrial economy, where people, stood in a line and put a widget into a box. I don't know. And then we had the knowledge economy, in which everybody was really excited because we were going to have access to all this knowledge and information. And I think most of us now are saying enough data, enough knowledge. There's so much that in some ways AI could be very hopeful, in that you could hopefully have something where, instead of when you say what shoes are best for people with a high arch, you just get a ton of, Google ads. You get some meaningful pre-sorted information back, right? That whole sector is changing a lot, or that whole knowledge economy is changing a lot. And I think we are really at the precipice of a creative economy, where many more people will be freed up to do creative work. We might go that way, we might not. I think, there are a lot of different things that come to play in that. But here we are as planners, when we put on our planning hats. How do we, we're not talking about arts and culture anymore. Creative, as you said, it's a pretty muddy space, which is good in some ways. But it makes planning hard. It makes planning hard to be able to say, here's what we should measure. You look at the NAICS codes. NAICS codes are what the government uses to classify jobs, right? So if you're a woodworker, do you do woodworking that's fine woodworking, or do you install furniture? And there's a code for each level. And a lot of those codes, you look at them and you're like, where's my code? My code isn't on here because my job didn't exist 10 years ago. Which makes planning and measurement and telling legislators how they might think about allocating their dollars really hard. Talking about the value of an artist in residence who helps the Department of Transportation problem solve differently. How do you convey how important that is? What have you guys learned about engaging legislators, engaging mayors, city councilors, people who make decisions about taxpayers' dollars, to invest more in a creative economy that's hard to define and hard to measure? What works for you guys? That's a hard question, I know.
I think some of it is framing the conversation around
Okay.
what the benefit is for them. You know, we've had a lot of conversations around, is it arts and culture or is it culture and art? You know, sometimes it feels like this esoteric thing that's out there, but culture is embodied, right? And it's a humanistic kind of experience. And so when you talk about it from those terms of culture and placemaking and quality of life and those kinds of things, I think it resonates. And you know, for us, I mean, we have a big, huge urban area in Washington state and a lot of rural areas as well, which many states are like that. And so I think that what we can do is sort of figure out what resonates with them. You know, for us in Washington, we have a comprehensive statewide strategy around the creative economy, around all of these different pieces and parts of the creative economy, the tech sector, arts and culture, creativity, you know, culture bearers, connection to the tribal, you know, governments and tribal entities, workforce development, arts, you know, education for, you know, career pathways and all of those kinds of things. And I think having that, and there are many, many partners at the table and built into this plan. It's headed primarily by our Department of Commerce, but we're at the table, the, you know, Department of Education here. It's called the Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction. So they're at the table, other types of organizations, other agencies as well. You know, so making that entire holistic kind of thing from within the government, but then also helping to bring those into the communities. So our goal is to not be like, oh, we're here in Olympia and then we're just going to have this thing. We're trying to site within the communities and provide these resources to communities themselves, and the regions can be more self-efficacicious through this. So they're the ones who know their communities best. They're the ones who know what's going to work best for them. And they're the ones who can develop the solutions with our support. That's kind of the approach that we've been taking. And, you know, it's fits and starts. I mean, of course, you know, but it is something that we can all point to as sort of like a true north. We're all going in this direction, and this is the direction we want to head.
Love it. I have a page of notes just from that. Claire?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I think it's about the interagency work. It's about centering these conversations, sometimes outside the cultural agency, or and bringing them in as partners. I think also to build on Annette's point. I mean, for us, the partner piece has been really important. So, like, who are we bringing? Who's bringing us into the agency relationship? You know, who's bringing us into commerce? Um, that's a trusted CDFI, you know, community development financial institution, or a trusted broker or intermediary, a trusted technical assistance provider around loans and grant programs that are not traditionally thought of as for the creative economy. So I think those private sector partners can also really help to broker some of these relationships as you build those connections, you know, toward your advocacy, that it's a coalition piece of work as opposed to just, you know, the creative sector kind of pushing into a space that may be newer for us.
So it sounds like you're, I just want to make sure I'm getting it. You work to find partners who help pave the way for you in a way that works for both the part, but then you're also then able to present yourselves in that new space. They've advised you how you can be effective. Because I have to say, it feels overwhelming to be like, you want me to go talk to the Department of Transportation? You know, that just feels kind of like way outside the zone. And I think a lot of us feel that way when we're asked to move into spaces where we just have never even, and so helping to pave that path, and having that intermediary, I hadn't really thought of that, and asking for that help with a CDFI or a whomever.
Yeah, and then you have to, I mean, that's a favor for them, but they're getting so much. I mean, you know, I have partners in nonprofit real estate developers, et cetera, who need the connections to the creative economy, you know, the workforce funders and the workforce intermediaries that we're working with. They want to connect with this workforce. You know, they want to know who these creatives are, these highly skilled, you know, trained potential employees that have a huge number of skills that they're interested in. They want connections to that entities. So it's not just out of the largesse of, their hearts or whatever that they're doing this. They're
There's
getting
actual value
out of
add for what the problems
yes,
they're trying to solve
yes,
too.
exactly.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, when people come together and have a shared sort of value set around, we want our community to thrive, et cetera, people will figure out ways to help it solve their other problems too. And
Right.
you got to kind of trust in that process, I guess. Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about what hasn't worked. I think one of the most compelling things we can do is share the things where it's like, we tried this, that bombed, and admittedly we did it wrong, or what we didn't think about, or whatever. Partly because of the humility of sort of saying the people who speak at conferences don't have everything figured out. We just happen to be on the screen, right? But also because there's something sort of like, wow, I never would have thought about that. And now that you shared that, I know to really drive around that pothole. Um, can you guys, I'll give you a minute to think about things where you feel like, yeah, I wish I had thought about that, or we shouldn't have gone about it that way around this creative economy planning, engaging legislators, engaging communities.
I mean, I can think of one example right away
Sure,
where
sure.
particularly on the workforce stuff, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
especially as a advocacy organization that is first and foremost dedicated to the creative economy and creatives and artists. um you start talking about, I won't say this is a complete failure, but it's certainly a learning experience in this work of you start talking about acknowledging the fact that creatives don't make all of their money from the creative economy or their creative
Mm-hmm.
practice. And you acknowledge the fact that we live in a society where that is not as valued as it should be. And,
Mm.
artists aren't just able to make art and thrive and live from that. And that is a very unstable, insecure place to be from a financial perspective and a livelihood perspective. And that has everything to do with, the world we live in, the country we live in specifically, and public will for that body of work. But you start talking about, providing pathways to stability through other vehicles, and that
Mm.
gets really sensitive right away, right? Like that's like, what are you talking about? Shouldn't you be advocating for me to make all my money from the
Being a
creative
creative.
work?
Yeah.
Yeah, from the creative entrepreneurship, from, selling my work, from, even as complicated as capitalism is, like engaging in, the sale of my creative product as opposed
Yeah.
to aligning whatever the other work is with the creative product. And hindsight, I probably would have started with um the message around that and the conversation around that coming from creatives, right? From like working, I would have started with like not me as the messenger, or not my team as the instigators of all this, because there are a number of creatives out there that really want to do this. And it isn't for everyone, but I think,
Mm.
reputationally we have to be careful that we're not like viewed as selling people out, right? That we're
Mm-hmm.
not just like saying, all right, well, we give up on artists as artists.
Mm-hmm.
We're
Yeah,
gonna
what do you care?
instrumentalize
You
them.
have food on the table, good enough. You get to do
Yeah,
art Saturday mornings.
right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So
Yeah,
it's a delicate dance there.
that bleeds into an Annette. I do want, if you have a story, I do want to come back, but it does bleed
Absolutely.
to this question of at what point are we all selling out by saying that art has a dollar price on it?
I don't think we are at all. I'm going to say
That's an
that
interesting
because
question.
I mean, people say that, but here's the thing: it's skill, it's value. Art has sort of, we have sort of, as humans, have this intrinsic need for that kind of stuff in our lives in one way or another. And there are some people who are very skilled at it, and some people who are not, right? And some people who just dabble around with it, but they have like a regular job. And I
Mm-hmm,
think
mm-hmm,
that part of the challenge, and we were talking about this a little bit earlier, is part of the challenge is, because we don't entirely have a mindset in America, unfortunately, about the importance of arts and culture in the way that they do in other countries. Like, so
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
I know, for like, our executive director went on a trade mission to Tasmania, and in
mm-hmm.
Tasmania they spend $27 per capita on arts and culture programming, which blew my mind. I mean,
What
that's
do we spend in
unbelievable.
the US? What do we spend in the US?
I don't know, it's like $2, I think is the average or something. Like it's state agencies. I don't know what it is at the federal level, probably
Wow.
much less than that. But,
Yes.
and so some of it is cultural, like what Claire was saying, but I also think some of it is about people not selling themselves short, right? And so sometimes artists and creatives, some of those skills that you as a business owner, like a more traditional business owner, that you learn about marketing and those kinds of things, for some artists and creatives, we know that feels really uncomfortable for them. They're like, I don't want to sell myself, I just want to make my stuff. And I think for those of us who sort of are in the institutional space, some of our role is to help them to understand that it is okay for them to price their products appropriately, and to be able to make money, and to do all of those kinds of things and provide the support mechanisms for them. I do think that we could definitely do a better job with that. I know that's one of the things that with our creative economy plan, that's one of the focus areas, is how do we support those creative entrepreneurs at the level that makes sense for them. Some of the creative entrepreneurs are going to go all out and create a whole big thing. And other people are just like, you know what? I just want to be able to like have a good life and pay my bills and go on vacation a couple times a year, like having, and that's okay. Neither one of those is a bad thing. But I think that creatives have to be willing to stand up and say, I have value, and not be shamed about that or any of that kind of stuff. And so it's some of the institutional space that we have. It's like, it's the same thing with working for nonprofits. A lot of times people think, oh, if you work for a nonprofit, you should just do it for the love, and you don't deserve to get paid
Feed your children
like living
love.
wages, right? And that's not true at all. I mean,
Yeah.
if you want to have a quality workforce that works in the nonprofit sector, yeah, they're going to love it, but they also should be compensated fairly. And
So
I think
Annette,
that
did you think of a story that you would a pothole that you would advise people to drive around?
well, it's interesting because I'm coming this from a government perspective.
Yeah.
And so for us,
Just tell us what your mayor did wrong. It's okay. It'll
right.
stay
Well, I'm
within
from the
this.
state government perspective, right? And so some of it is around that messaging to legislators, or understanding what their value set is around arts and culture. And I think that some of it is data, honestly, is there are sometimes artists and creatives are very like emotional about, we're going to talk about the emotional impact of art, which is important, but we also have to talk about the other impacts that art and culture has as well within a community. And I think that being a little bit more explicit about that is important and can help people to understand. I think here in Washington, I mean, the creative economy has been strong, but it wasn't really being looked at in a very, at the level that it is now, until, we started delving into some of the data and looking at, wow, this actually makes up 10% or 15% of our GDP here. That's a huge deal. And that's when they started realizing how important it was, and so unfortunately, because we live in America, there is that tie to capitalism. And I think to a certain degree, it's unavoidable.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's shift. And I didn't remind everyone, I'm hoping by this point in the week, folks know that the Q&A in the menu bar at the bottom of the Zoom screen, the Q&A in these webinar environments is where you can ask questions. And I'm tracking it. I see Susan has put up a comment about how, yeah, we do have lots of data, yes, but a lot of it hasn't really been parsed well. The other thing that I would say is that a lot of not only data sets that we as a nation have, but processes for collecting data are pretty exclusive and tend to, as a friend of mine who is native says, invisibilize a lot of people. And so I don't mean to say that we have enough data, we don't need more data. I would say in many ways, it's time for America to start collecting data more thoughtfully and using it more equitably. But
Agree with that for sure.
if you have questions, I'm doing my best to track them, so pop them in there. So the topic of this, as you guys know, is around economic development and planning for the creative industries to thrive within that sphere of economic development. You guys in Washington recently completed a plan for your creative industries, very much with the lens of economic development. What were some of the big takeaways, Annette, from some of the planning and what you guys found, what works, what doesn't?
That's a great question. I mean, I think some of that was being able to allow the organizations and the institutions that are working in a space to participate within that space, right? It would be easy to just say, oh, it's only economic development folks that are doing this, but it's not. It's, it's educational folks and it's workforce development. In Washington, we have a slightly different model for economic development than they do in other counties, in that we have a Department of Commerce, but economic development within a community happens more at the local level. So there's kind of like levels to that. And so a lot of it is that the economic development that happens within a county, for example, is very much determined by the ADO, Associate Development Organization, so the local economic development agency. But they have an ability to roll up to these larger plans and help people, so that there's connection points to that. And so there's stuff that feeds between the two. So the top level, like state government, and then down to the local level, and making sure that there's a lot of opportunities for people to sort of cycle up and down in that space, and provide that for us has been really helpful. One of the things that we have, which we found was really interesting, is even though we have this huge tech sector here in Washington, or creative tech sector here in Washington state, we also have a kind of a gap for those skill sets in getting students into those jobs, local students into those jobs. And, even folks who aren't going to go the 4-year college degree route, there's no reason why those folks wouldn't be able to have opportunities. And so, we have small scale projects, but using things like skill centers, student skill centers to develop some of these things and to be able to do that. So those were some things that were really, really interesting. I mean, obviously most of the creative sector jobs here in Washington are in the Seattle kind of metro area, but there's pockets in other places. And so the idea is to help those communities figure out what their sort of sub-focus within the creative sector is in a region, and then be able to move that forward. I can say that from my perspective, the counties and the cities that have built arts and culture and the creative sector into their comprehensive plans and into, those kinds of plans, have made things happen a lot more quickly, right? And have a stronger economy, a local economy around that, than the ones that haven't. And so I think that's a really important thing. And that's one of the things we want to help folks do a little bit better.
Wow. That's really interesting, to make sure that creative and arts and culture is a part of every single economic development plan. That's interesting. Claire, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I think I just said, just passed our creative economy strategy in this legislative session. So Washington's is done and ours is not started yet. From my seat, the not so secret agenda in passing something like that, or working that through the legislature, was to essentially get the government to sign off on a bunch of agenda items that our sector has, right? And like with their imprimatur, with their thumbs up, and say, yep, this is how we need to invest in this creative economy. I also will say we haven't done any sort of statewide research around the Illinois creative economy in about 10 years. So it was also a research play to try and just get that done as part of this task force. So it's, a research agenda, and also kind of setting a policy agenda that the legislators and the Association of Counties and Association of Illinois Mayors and all these folks that are going to have representatives on this task force, they are then signing off on a plan to invest in this. So then we get to go back to them when they are not as friendly to some of the things we want to do, and say, hey, actually, this was in a plan that you signed off on, or your representative signed off on. So I think there's sort of that, political, I mean, it's a pretty political move to try and get folks engaged and invested in a conversation that they may not have spent a lot of time with before.
Here in New Mexico, we have maybe some of the same characteristics in the Albuquerque and Santa Fe and Las Cruces. So along our Rio Grande corridor, we have, not big cities like you all have Seattle and Chicago, but that's where our cities are, right? And the rest of the state is very rural. And so we have a big divide culturally within our legislature because we have very rural communities. The southeastern part of the state derives most of its revenue from oil and gas, which frankly pays for a lot of the rest of the state's activities. But a lot of the rest of the state is more preoccupied with diversification. So politically, as you say, what's the value set and what are the perspectives of legislators? It's so distinct across our state that it's hard to imagine how a plan can be appealing to all those different legislators. And at least in this case, we really need their support and their buy-in, because without that, we can't have a state vision that has a division that's pursuing that on behalf of all New Mexicans, right? So it's like, it's a complicated puzzle. And I'm wondering how you guys have, to some extent, maybe figured out how to balance the needs of rural communities, which often harbor a lot of art culture, and increasingly are where artists can afford to live, with the fast-paced, sort of a lot more money lifestyle and sort of the big overwhelmingness of these cities that feel like they outshine, but in some ways are not where a lot of us want to live, including me. I live very rurally. So how do you guys find ways to balance the needs of rural and highly urbanized communities around creative stuff?
That's an interesting question. So I think in Washington, yeah, we have a lot of money in sort of the Seattle metro area, the King County area. We have some of those communities that have legislation within their own counties or within their own cities that is like a cultural access tax, essentially. So it's a small amount of sales tax that can go and develop, so it's a lot of influx from the local community into that thing. So they have this in King County, which is where Seattle is. It's called Doors Open. They estimate that it's going to generate $170 million a year in revenue for arts and culture organizations within the county, which is fantastic for them. And, it sort of leaves a huge gap for other communities and other regions. And so, some of it is around, I think, understanding what the needs are of the rural folks and how they want to apply arts and culture, what it means to them. It's more culture and heritage and, connecting to that kind of thing than it is art per se for art's sake, even though artistic expression exists within all of these communities and that sort of thing. So, for us, I think a lot of it is understanding that value set, and, it's going to be different. So it's like, in some ways, it's having a really comprehensive marketing and communications plan and understanding what the different value sets are, how to talk to people within these certain things. The sort of language that you use, I think, is really important. Oftentimes the arts and culture advocacy folks, including us, we come from, sort of big liberal cities and approach everybody from that mindset, which, there's other things that we can talk about with arts and culture that are important in it. A lot of it is finding out what that really means for them and approaching it in that way, both legislators, but then also for people within communities and understanding it and having empathy for what their experience is, and it's a challenge. I mean, it's really difficult to kind of make inroads at first, but it's just, it's an iterative process. You start and then you keep building on it and keep building on it. And then once those folks can see those kinds of things, making small changes within their communities, then it has this big ripple effect and bigger things start to happen as well.
Claire, my father-in-law grew up in Southern Illinois in Payson, a very small town. And we went there about a year ago, and it has not fared well. Unlike the town my husband grew up in, which is also a rural but larger town called Pontiac, Illinois. Pontiac's about 9,000 people. Payson's about 900 or maybe less. And it was striking to me because on this trip, we went to Payson. It's outside of St. Louis. It's on the Illinois side of the river. And it's really been decimated by the farm economy becoming corporatized. There's a lot of meth in the community. It's distressful. It is. And then you go up to my husband, where he grew up, which is Pontiac, that has Route 66 going through it. It's about an hour and 20 minutes from the city. And there is now a train that you can ride into downtown Chicago. They had a murals program about 3 years ago, 4 years ago, right before COVID. So there are something like 25 murals all across this
Yep.
town.
Yep.
There are 3 museums. There's the Route 66 Museum with all these old cars. It's the county seat, which helps because that's got a nice steady flow of revenue just from county activities. But I would argue that what saved his little town is the creative economy and proximity to Chicago. Um, so exciting, though, to see some of our rural communities embrace, as you said, Annette, the heritage and really go back to who are we? They have one of the best Threshers Day parade in all of Illinois. It is so fun. And
Yep.
they said, we're a farm town and we have Route 66, and let's go all in on who
Yep.
we are.
Yep.
And it is working. I mean, you go there and you feel like you stepped into sort of this beautiful, it's also diverse. You can get great Mexican food, great Vietnamese food. That is different. And for young people, they kind of cruise through there and go, hey, we could live here.
Yep.
They look at a house that costs $280,000 and they go, oh my God, we might really actually be able to live here. So there is a bright sort of horizon.
You can find a house in Washington for $280,000.
It's unbelievable. But there are some towns in middle America and rural America who are saying, let's go with the creative economy. Let's be who we are, best at it. Let's really mine our heritage, our culture, and bring that forward. And so I just want to say, there tends to be this rhetoric about rural living that's kind of this, but there are some communities that have figured out how to do it extremely well, and they have pulled together plans and put together dollars, and it's working. So I just wanted to share that because I've spent a lot of time in Illinois now.
Very true. Yes. Thank you for highlighting some of many really vibrant communities in Illinois. I mean, Pontiac is a special place in a very, very agricultural community.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And so, but from our perspective, one of the things that I think we've been most excited about in supporting our colleagues, particularly in smaller communities and rural areas, is the sort of help desk work we've been doing around access.
Tell us about that.
So it's a government help desk, right? It's right now funded with ARPA funds. It is particularly focused on access to government programs that creatives and cultural organizations maybe traditionally haven't applied for. So not necessarily the state arts agency grants or your local arts agency grants, but small business development grants, loan programs, things that are, some capital work. And a lot of that, just to Annette's relationship building piece, that's involved late night phone calls right up against deadlines with our staff, people walking through applications step by step to get them through a process. It's a lot of really deep technical assistance work to get folks access, or at least submit an application for access to new dollars. And of course, the rewards there are often financial for them, and allows them to do things that they otherwise maybe wouldn't have the access to do. And so that type of work is just really, really rewarding for us. And it is how we're building. It's one thing to ask folks to advocate, alongside you and build their relationships with legislators. And it's a whole other thing to help them to get access to the thing that you've advocated for.
Yeah.
So I think it's really important.
I think that's a great point, Claire. I just wanted could I just build on that for a second, Alice? Because I really think that one of the things that we've seen about in rural communities particularly is they feel very disconnected from government, from the places where power exists, where, big cities and that sort of thing. And so being able to provide that access to them and making sure that they can participate and that there's like no wrong door approach essentially to those kinds of services helps to bring them in. I have found in my community development work that I do and economic development work that going to those communities and being in community with people is extremely important, so I think that's something that that those of us who are at advocacy/government level could do better is being in community, right? So when you show up, that's important. That's important for, and if you show up in cities, that's important, but it's also important in rural communities. And what I think that does is it helps to increase trust in institutions, increase trust in government, and makes our entire collective system a lot more whole. And it hopefully helps to reduce some of the the division that exists already, and because of the political climate. Anything we can do to help reduce that and recognize like, hey, we're all people here, we all want the same thing. I think that is the key to making sure that people feel a part of the creative economy.
Absolutely. Beautifully said, Annette. Well, I'm going to bring this to a close by inviting you guys to just share one last thought, if you have one. Anything you'd like to say? Go Raiders? No, I'm just kidding. I don't. I don't
like for me, I think the language we use is really important. And Alice, appreciate your framing of this conversation in the creative economy lens. Like I am tending to just to use everything at once at the moment. It's like arts, culture, and creativity. The whole, I say it all just to include all the things. I know. But I do think the arts language has really done us a disservice for a very long time. And so it's hard to be true to artists and then, and which we still want to do. And then also be more expansive about connecting that work to folks with language that resonates more, which includes creativity and the creative sector. So just appreciate your understanding of that and your framing of this series within that lens. And we got to all keep doing that. I talked to someone who was very close to involved artists with the big artist relief grant, the private program that gave the $5,000 artist grants over COVID. And, hindsight 2020, one of the founders said, she wished she would have called it something else. Right. So, I mean, I do think sometimes the arts language really disconnects us from the work that we're trying to move forward.
That's insightful. Yeah. Thank you.
Appreciate that.
Annette?
Yeah. So, I mean, for me, it's all about that connection point and helping people to recognize that each one of us is part of a greater whole. With our creative districts, we have this like stone soup analogy. So the kids book, right? So if every person can come together and, can contribute just a little thing, eventually you get to create something that's really spectacular that everybody can share and everybody can benefit from, and that takes time. But it's ultimately worth it. And I think, especially when you're talking about that urban rural divide, like helping people to understand that New Mexico is all one connected thing, right? Illinois is all one connected thing. Washington is all one connected thing. And we're all one connected thing here as a country in some way, as well. And so making sure that we can do that, to me, I think is something that will be helpful for folks to recognize. Like there's more commonalities than there are differences, and arts and culture and heritage helps to bridge those divides.
Beautifully said. Wow. Well, I loved meeting you ladies, and I can't wait to stay in touch. I am so grateful for your time. On behalf of New Mexico, thank you for sharing your expertise. Again, Annette Roth with the state of Washington and Claire Rice with the Illinois Arts Alliance. Ladies, have a great weekend.